All right, Dennis.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Dennis Falloon, and I'm a District 7 Safety Academy Coordinator and a District 7 consultant. And I'd like to welcome you, if this is your first time, and even if you've been here before, to the 7th topic of the District 7 Safety Academy. And this is our second series, so the second year that they've been in place. And today we're going to hear about signing and pavement marking, retroreflectivity, and will be presented today by Greg Schertz, who's a PE. He works with the Federal Lands Highway Safety. He's a Federal Lands Highway Safety Discipline Champion. He works for FHWA. He's been with them for about 35 years, and 29 of those years have been focused on safety. I'll now go into my presentation about a little intro on the Safety Academy. As always, I've mentioned before that these webinars are providing information regarding safety-related issues to enhance your local safety programs. We are doing the second series webinars now, and they begin around 10 a.m. and to 12. They cover about 1 to 2 hours. If you need to register, you would go to this link here on the SurveyMonkey. That will be changing in the near future to GoToMeeting, so you just have to stay posted on your notices that you get in the email. Also, like Anthony just showed you, there's the Tampa Bay TrafficSafety.com webpage that you can go to, not only for information about the Safety Academy, but the Safety Summit and other aspects of safety in District 7. And then also the link, that same link also provides you with the recordings of the previous webinars. And like I mentioned earlier, today we are doing the signing and pavement marking retroreflectivity topic. And want to mention briefly about the PDHs for Florida's PEs. Once again, the Academy PDH coordinator is Larry Hagan, Consultant Services, and you can email him at that address, or you can fax it to him, and you'll receive a certificate for 1 PDH. And as Anthony showed you, there is a link that he showed you on the screen, which I'm highlighting here again, to get the form. And then you can send it in to Anthony. I wanted to also mention that the stuff for the AICP has actually been submitted and for approval, and that's still in the works, and that kind of credit will occur retroactively. We're also working on the third series of the safety topics, so they're currently under development, and they'll begin in January of 2015. So just check your email and see if you hear anything about it. And this is my contact information, so if you have any questions, email me or give me a call. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Greg and let him present his webinar. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan.
And I wanted to add, if anybody has questions during the presentation, go ahead and type them into the chat, and we will do our best to answer those questions as they come.
Thank you. This is Greg Schertz. As I was introduced, I work for the Federal Lands Highway part of Federal Highway Administration. That's my primary job, but also part of my job is to work with our headquarters office as the FHWA Retroreflectivity team leader. And so in that capacity, I've been responsible for leading the team that developed the retroreflectivity standards for signs and pavement markings. It was a congressionally mandated task that FHWA received, so we had no choice in the matter, not that we wouldn't have tried to put out some kind of retroreflectivity guidelines anyway, but when Congress told us we had to develop a standard, we pretty much have to do as Congress says. And so I'm going to take you through what we have developed and what the standards are, and as was just mentioned, if you have questions as I go, please enter those in the chat pod, and we'll address those as we go through the presentation. So what I plan to cover today is an overview of the sign retroreflectivity requirements, what changed and what did not. Some of you might be familiar with the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or the MUTCD, and know that the 2009 edition, which is the latest edition, has had 2 revisions since then. And part of the sign retroreflectivity requirements did change with one of those revisions. And so I'll cover that to make sure you understand what did change and what did not, what still remains as a standard. And then part of the standard for sign retroreflectivity really focuses on methods for maintaining sign retroreflectivity. And I'm going to go through each allowed method that's covered in the MUTCD and try to help you understand what your options are. And having been in this position for quite some time, we receive questions about it all the time. And some of the more common questions I've put into this presentation, and I'll cover those. But again, if you've got other questions, enter those in the chat pod and we'll cover those. And then also, Congress directed FHWA to develop standards for pavement marking retroreflectivity. And I will update you on the status of that. The sign retroreflectivity standards came out first. The pavement marking standards have not come out, but they're about to. And I'll update you on the status of those. So let's start out first of all. Oh, wait a minute. Before I move on, if I could bring up that first polling question, I'd like to get a feel for the participation we have today, and whether you're from a public agency or a private consultant. So,
She don't want it off because her hair is a mess.
can we bring up that poll?
Yes, they are able to see the poll on their end and are currently voting.
Oh, okay, I'm not seeing it.
We'll give them a second, and once the poll gets closed, I believe the results will show up on the screen. Right now we have 75% public agency, 21% consultant, 4% other.
Okay, I'm seeing it now.
Okay. And with 84% of the attendance voting, I guess we can close this poll here. And do the results come up on screen? Share. There we go.
It'd be nice to let everyone see that.
Yep, there's the results up on the screen. They see 72% public agency, 21 consultants, 2% mix, and 5% other.
Okay, well that's a good mix. Primarily public agency, but we've got some consultants in there too, which certainly are in the business of helping the public agencies. So I think all of you could benefit from this presentation. I hope you do, and I'll find out at the end whether it did help you or not. So I'll move on now. And not knowing your experience level or how long you've been involved in this business, let me cover a basic thing to start off with, and that's just to introduce the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which we commonly call the MUTCD. And that's a document that's published by the Federal Highway Administration, and it is recognized as the national standard for all traffic control devices. And we get a lot of questions about, well, does that MUTCD apply to my road? Because I'm with a county, or I'm with a city, or I'm with a private business that has a street outside my business. Does it apply? Well, it actually does. It applies to traffic control devices installed on any street, highway, bikeway, or private road open to public travel. So if you've got a roadway that's open to public travel, it's not gated off and locked, this MUTCD does apply. And it's the standard that says, for example, all stop signs shall be octagonal and shall be red in color. That's one of the more basic ones. But the main thing is that it does apply to all your roads that are open to public travel. And this standard of sign retroreflectivity is included within this MUTCD. And there's a link shown here. If you want to go to that link, it's on our FHWA webpage, and it's free. You can view it, you can download it, you can do anything you want with it. If you want to purchase a hard copy, FHWA is not in the business of making money or selling these things. There are other associations that sell them, such as ASTO or LATSA, the American Traffic Safety Services Association. Those are associations that sell hard copies if you want. But if you just want to download it or download parts of it, just go to this website and you can do that for free. The current edition came out in 2009, and as I mentioned just previously, it's had 2 revisions, 1 and 2, and the latest revision was in May of 2012. So now within that MUTCD, there's a table in the first part of it that gives you compliance dates. And those are compliance dates for relatively new standards that are in the MUTCD. So be careful here. What I'm showing you is what was in the MUTCD for compliance dates regarding sign retroreflectivity in 2009 when it came out. So I'm going to go through this, but then I'm going to show you what changed in 2012. So what you're seeing on your screen right now is not current, but it sets the stage for what remains in the MUTCD and what you'll be responsible for. So let's go through this. There's 3 compliance dates that were established in 2009, and actually, if you want to know a little bit of the history, the sign retroreflectivity standard came out in 2007. It just was not in the published version of the MUTCD until 2012. So the standard has been in place for, what's that now, 7 years. But the first provision that you see in this table is implementation and continued use of an assessment or management method that is designed to maintain traffic sign retroreflectivity at or above the established minimum levels. And the compliance date was January of 2012. So take a close look at what we're saying there in the provision. It says the use of a method. That's what's required. And I'm going to go through what that means here in a little bit. What do we mean by method? There's some different methods available for you to use. And then it says designed to maintain traffic sign retroreflectivity at or above the established minimum levels. I'm going to show you a table that gives you those minimum levels. So what we're talking about here is maintenance of your signs. It's not a minimum standard for what the sign needs to be when it's installed new. This means that signs need to be above a certain level of retroreflectivity for safety of drivers at night, and this guideline or this standard actually would require you to set up the method to have your maintenance program replacing those signs before they degrade down to the minimum levels. So then let's look at these next 2 compliance dates. The first one was to replace identified regulatory warning and ground-mounted guide signs, with the exception of street name signs. And so if you have any of those regulatory warning or guide signs that were assessed and found to be below the minimum levels, they used to be required to be replaced before January of 2015. And then the next one was replace identified street name and overhead guide signs that are below the minimum levels. Those were going to be required to be replaced by January 2018. Well, what happened from the time the new standard came out in 2007 until 2012, there was some changes that were made. And here's what remains in the MUTCD and what's important to you now. And here I'm going to start at the bottom of the table. You'll see that the actual compliance date for replacement of bad signs, that was removed. there is no longer compliance states for replacing your bad signs. And I'll come back to that here in a second. Now we'll go back up to the top of the table where I've got the red lettering, and you'll see that the provision now says implementation and continued use of a method that's designed to maintain regulatory and warning sign retroreflectivity above the minimum levels. So now the compliance state only applies to your regulatory and warning signs. And you've got a compliance date of June 2014. Well, that just passed. So what that means is we've passed our deadline, and if you are not implementing a method that's designed to maintain your regulatory and warning signs above the established minimum levels, you probably need to consider doing something fairly quickly. So I'm going to come back to this table in a little bit, but this is what's in the MUTCD now, and it is the only compliance state remaining for sign retroreflectivity. So an obvious question would be, well then, if I've got a regulatory warning sign below the minimum levels, when do I have to replace it? That's up to you. If you know you have a bad sign, you probably need to be taking action to be replacing it. But we all know that not all public agencies have enough money to replace every sign they want, and so they have to make some management decisions about what their priorities are. What you'll have to do with your decision, if you have a sign, for example, that's below the minimum, and you decide I'm going to replace it in 5 years, if there's ever a crash and someone believes your bad sign contributed to that crash, you're going to have to defend your decision to replace it in 5 years instead of right away. So now we said in there that the standard in the MUTCD says you need to have a method in place designed to keep your signs above minimum levels in Table 2A3. This is the table that's in the MUTCD. And I won't go into it in detail, but I want to explain how it works. And there were no changes to this provision. This is still the standard. The minimums in the table did not change in 2012. So if you look at that table now, the left-hand column says sign color. And so you can divide your signs by color. So your white on green would be guide signs. Your black on yellow or black on orange, those are your warning signs, both permanent and in construction zones or maintenance zones. Then you've got your white on red and also black on white, and those are both regulatory signs. So once you figure out what color your sign is, then you can go across the table, and you need to know, in some cases anyway, what sheeting type you have out there. Is it ASTM sheeting type 1, 2, 3, or then 3 on up to 10? Let's pick a simple one first and just look at black on white, which would apply to, for example, speed limit signs. So if we go to that left-hand column, black on white, and then go across to the right, it says that the retroreflectivity of W, which is stands for white, needs to be greater than or equal to 50. And for those of you that don't really know what 50 means, 50 in the color white is relatively easy to obtain. Most of your guide signs, speed limit signs, not guide signs, your speed limit signs, most of those that have been out there maybe less than 20 years are probably fine. If they've been out there longer than that, you may need to take a look at them. But that 50 applies regardless of what type of sheeting you had. Now let's go up a little bit and look at white on red. So that would be like stop signs, yield signs, other types of white on red regulatory signs. And you go across and you look at the minimums. The W, or white, needs to be greater than or equal to 35. And the red part of it, or R, needs to be greater than or equal to 7. Now, for The white on reds, there's an additional criteria that applies. If you'll go over to the right-hand column, under additional criteria, there's a note 4, and it says, for these white on red signs, the minimum, look at the note at the bottom of the table, minimum sign contrast ratio greater than 3:1. And that, you figure that by taking your white retroreflectivity and dividing it by the red retroreflectivity. And that needs to be greater than 3:1. So that's an additional criteria in addition to the minimum levels of 35 and 7. And the reason for that is, as all of you know, in Florida especially, you have problems with the red on signs fading. And so if your white is fine for retroreflectivity and your red is fading away and you have a decent amount of retroreflectivity for red, but the color is almost gone, it's maybe pink now, that's when your contrast will not meet the 3:1. So that's what that's trying to address. Now let's go up one more column in the sign color and look at black on yellow or black on orange, and let's go across. And you'll see there that now we've got two different categories depending on the sheeting type. So the first column you see is under beaded sheeting type 1. Well, that's commonly referred to as engineering grade, and that's what most of us used many years ago. And you'll look there for both yellow and O for orange, there's an asterisk there. And so you look at the bottom of the table, the asterisk says, this sheeting type shall not be used for this color. That means that you cannot use engineering grade sheeting for your warning signs because it doesn't meet the driver's needs at night. And then you go across the table a little further to the right. For any other type of sheeting you use, the minimum for yellow is 50, and for orange it's 50, but there's two rows now, and the other row is 75. Well, that's when you have to look over at your notes there. And you look at the notes at the bottom of the page, 2 and 3. So it basically says for your larger signs, you can use the lower number of 50. For the smaller signs or more complex, like with text on it instead of a bold message, you need to use the larger number of 75. And in order to make things simpler, what a lot of agencies have done is just said, we're not going to mess with that. It's too complicated. We're just going to establish 75 as our minimum and run with that. And that gives you a little extra factor of safety for your drivers at night. So that sums up that table. So I'm going to keep moving on now.
There is a question in the chat about the table.
Okay.
Since the white has to be 35 and the contrast ratio has to be 3:1, then isn't the real red value 35:3 or approximately 12?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you read it one more time?
Sure thing. It says, since the W has to be 35 and the contrast ratio has to be 3:1, then isn't the real R value 35:3 or approximately 12?
Well, no, not really. There's three separate things to consider. Don't look at it as 35 divided by 7. Through research, we've established that drivers need a minimum value of 35 for white, and they need a minimum value of 7 for red. But they also need that minimum contrast ratio of 3:1. So those numbers, when you go measure your sign in the field, the white could be, I don't know, let's just say it's 60. And if your red is 20, then you've got an okay contrast ratio of 3:1. But if you've got 60 for white, which is good, and red is 10, which is good, no, reverse that. You've got white of 60 and you read of 30, those are both good for your minimum values, but now your contrast ratio is only 2 to 1, and that's not enough contrast for drivers. So don't think of it as 35 divided by 7 and what that should be. Think of it as 3 separate requirements and look at those separately, and I think that'll answer the question. I hope it does.
Yeah. There was also a question about the method, or the having a method for monitoring the retroreflectivity.
Okay.
What is the consequence, the penalty, for not having a method?
I'm going to get to that. It's a great question. I addressed that at the end of the presentation.
Okay.
So if you'll just hold on to that thought, make sure I address that for you.
And there's another question: why in the table there is no reference for type 11, type X1 sheeting?
Yeah, that's a great question. You guys are on top of it. When we did the research to establish the minimum and figure out what drivers needed as a minimum retroreflectivity, type 11 was not on the market. And by the time we published this in 2007, type 11 had been introduced into the marketplace. However, we had not conducted research on it. And so we're not going to publish a minimum just by guessing and not knowing what drivers really need. So that's why it's not in there. Now in the real world, for all practical purposes, if you have a type 11 out there, it is not degraded yet to a value that's no longer of benefit to the drivers, and you're fine. So eventually we'll be modifying this table to include type 11 and take out some of these types that are no longer available on the market, for example. But if you're using type 11, you don't need to worry about minimums at this point in time. So now I want to go back to the compliance dates after I've addressed this table and make sure we understand that. Again, there's no compliance date as far as the feds go for replacing your signs that don't meet those minimum numbers. But now you know there is a table with minimums in there, and you are required by standard to have a method in place that's designed to maintain regulatory and warning signs at or above established minimum levels. So the standard still says you have to have a method in place to maintain the retroreflectivity of all your signs, but the compliance date only applies for your method for regulatory and warning signs. So if you want to, what that means is you can stage this. If this is just too big of a deal for you to handle right now, to have a method to be assessing all your signs, including street name signs, you can just focus on regulatory and warning signs right now. That should have been done already, but if you don't have it in place now, you need to probably get moving on it. And then as you get comfortable with your method and your system and your process, then as resources allow, you start adding your guide signs to your method and start assessing those, and then start figuring out, okay, we've got signs now that don't meet. What's our priority? Which signs should we be replacing first? When should we do that? Those are your decisions to make, but also your decisions to defend if questioned on it. So I'm going to go back now to what's in the MUTCD. And this has not changed since 2007. That first part, the grade part, I showed you earlier, and that's the actual standard itself. It says you shall use a method designed to maintain your sign retro above those levels I just showed you. Now here's some additional guidance that's also in the MUTCD, and it's also been in there since 2007. It says, except for those signs specifically identified in paragraph 6, which I'll mention here in a minute, one or more of the following assessment or management methods should be used to maintain your sign retroreflectivity. So that's kind of saying that, okay, we're requiring you to use a method in that first sentence. And this second sentence says, we're going to suggest that you use one of these methods. That's why it's a should condition. It's not a shall, but here are some methods we know work, and you would be allowed to use them, and you could use those as defense if questioned in court. Now, the first part of the sentence is, except for those signs specifically identified in paragraph 6. You can go to the METCD and look this up. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but basically it has an exclusion of brown signs and blue signs and those signs that are not necessarily important for safety, such as no parking signs. The parking signs on the side of your urban street that says no parking from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., those don't have to meet minimum retroreflectivity. The METCD does say they have to be retroreflective, but there's no minimum maintenance requirement on those. So let's start getting into the methods now. I said in the last slide, oh, wait a minute, let me back up. If I could have a poll question first, the next poll question, and that deals with how many of you knew about this rule and that the dates that I showed you, you actually knew about those before we came into this webinar. So it looks like about half of you knew about it. Quite a few did not. So I hope for those of you that already knew about it, I'll be able to help clarify some of it for you. And for those that did not know about it, I'm really glad you're attending because this is probably fairly important to you as an agency to know about. So let's keep moving on. Thank you for that poll. So let's get into our methods now. These are the methods that the METCD says you should use. And there, you can see here in red I've put the word method. So there's 5 basic methods that are allowed. Now the first method, you could actually consider it 3 different methods if you wanted to, but it's really just one method. It's going out at night and making a visual inspection. But it's not just going out and making a visual inspection. Any one of you, the 75 attendees on this webinar, could go out and do a visual inspection method and make a decision on whether the sign looks okay to you or not. But how do you know it's above those minimum levels in the table? That's what's required in the METCD. The METCD doesn't say go out and do a visual nighttime inspection and you decide. You have to use one of these procedures in order for it to be a legitimate visual nighttime inspection. And I'm going to go through these different procedures with you, and I'm going to explain each one of these 5 methods so you'll understand what your options are. So I'm going to first cover the visual nighttime inspection method and those 3 different procedures that are allowed. Under the visual nighttime inspection method, you use a trained person to observe traffic signs during the night. So the trained is a key word there. And the key to this method is using an approved procedure. So one of those 3 procedures listed down here, comparison panels, calibration signs, or consistent parameters. So if we look first, we're still staying within the visual nighttime inspection method, but let's look at the comparison panel procedure. With this procedure, you have comparison panels that you either cut out of existing worn signs or you can purchase these from a sign manufacturer. And those comparison panels are small, maybe 3 inches by 6 inches. They can be any size, kind of like in that picture I took over on the right. But those comparison panels are very close to the minimum values in that table. So your trained inspector views roadway signs at night. And the good thing about when you do a nighttime inspection, for those of you that have done it, most signs are fairly easy to say, you know what, that sign is, I know it's good. There's no question about it. Or signs are dead, 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 and you know they're bad. They're not retroreflective. You know they're not going to be visible to the older driver. You know they have to be replaced. But the problem comes in when you have those marginal signs and you're trying to make a judgment. Do they meet the minimum level in that table or not? That's when you use your comparison panels. You'll stop your vehicle, you get out, you clip those panels to your marginal signs, and then you stand back anywhere from 30 to 50 feet with a flashlight, and you hold your flashlight up next to your face. You shine the flashlight at your sign, and if the sign appears less bright than the comparison panel, the sign needs to be replaced because you're comparing your actual sign to a panel that's at the minimum levels. So here in my picture, I just gave you an example. I actually had two different comparison panels made up, one at the 50 level and one at the 75 level. So if you looked at that picture and you were comparing it to the 50 level, the poor or the darker comparison panel, you would say my sign is brighter than that comparison panel and it meets and it's okay. Now if I'm comparing it to the other panel, the one on the bottom, is my sign brighter or less bright than that panel? It's pretty close. It's probably, you could say it meets, but you know as signs degrade, especially in Florida, it's probably not going to make it past another year. So you might want to check it and put it on your list for replacement. So that's how the comparison panel procedure works. So we've covered that one. Now let's go to the second procedure. We're still under the visual nighttime inspection method. We've just now decided to use a different procedure, and it's called calibration signs procedure. So calibration signs, just like the comparison panels, but they're full-size signs made at about the retroreflectivity levels in that table. Your inspection's still conducted at night. It's still conducted by a trained inspector. The way you conduct this procedure is you set up your calibration signs the night you're going to do your inspection. And you take a look at it from your vehicle at night, and the inspector calibrates your eyes. Okay, that's what signs at the minimum levels look like. And then you go and drive your roads, and all you're doing is the inspector is trying to make a decision. The signs I see on my road, are they brighter or less bright than the calibration signs I looked at earlier in the night? If the sign appears less bright than the calibration sign, according to the memory of the inspector, then that sign should be replaced. And people often say, boy, that doesn't sound like a very accurate method to me. I'm not going to use that. You know what? The whole goal of this standard was to get rid of the bad signs on the road. This calibration signs procedure is not exact, but we've decided it's good enough. And it's a practical way of conforming to the standard. So if you wanted to use this procedure in this method, it would be allowed, and it is defensible in court. So that's how you use the calibration signs procedure. So now let's go to the third procedure, and that's called consistent parameters procedure.
Greg, question from the chat.
Okay, what's that?
The sign reflectivity requirement, this applies to all roads, not just state highway. This is local roads and city roads as well?
That's correct. All roads open to public travel. Wish I could see those chats. It would help me. Is there a way that I can?
As an organizer, you should be able to. It's actually not in the chat. It's in the questions.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Pop out the questions, and then you can see them all on there.
Yep, that'll help. Thank you.
And how do you measure the values for the test panel or the calibration signs is another question.
Well, you can order them directly from a sign manufacturer, and then they come, and you know they're at a level that is close to those values in the table. Or what some agencies are doing is they're replacing signs on their own. You're always replacing old signs. What they're doing is they're using a handheld retroreflectometer, either that they purchase or that they borrow or that they rent. And they're measuring those old signs that they have been throwing in a waste pile or recycle pile. And if they find a sign in that pile that's close to the minimums, then they cut that up and use that for their comparison panels. Or they could keep the sign whole and use it as a calibration sign. So the third procedure is consistent parameters. And what we tried to do with this procedure is we tried to duplicate the parameters used in our research to develop the minimum levels. So in our research, we selected an SUV and a pickup as our design vehicle. And our design driver was 60 years old. And so we decided, and we have found through some experimentation that this works. If you can have a trained inspector that views the signs at night, and your inspector knows what to look for and how this procedure works and why it works, they use an SUV or a pickup for their inspection vehicle, and the inspector is 60 years old or older, then that's simulating what we used in research. And all the inspector has to do is decide whether the sign meets their needs or not. And as you can see in this picture, we have a younger driver driving. The person in the passenger seat is our inspector. Now, we took the picture during daytime. You have to actually conduct this inspection at night. But it is a very simple way of meeting this method in the MUTCD. This is the only procedure where you have to have the inspector over 60 years old. Those other two procedures we mentioned, comparison panels and calibration signs, I never mentioned the age. It doesn't matter the age of the inspector. But for this particular procedure, the driver does have to be older, and they need to be in a particular type of vehicle. And it's just their judgment call of whether the sign meets their needs or not at night. So now we've covered the visual nighttime inspection method, and there were 3 different procedures. The next method, the second method, is called measured sign retroreflectivity. And it's just like I have in the picture there. You measure each sign with a retroreflectometer. And when you get that measurement, it's a digital readout on the handheld instrument, and it's pretty simple. You compare the digital readout to those numbers in the table, and you replace those signs that don't meet the values in the table. This procedure can be done during the day. It almost always is during the day. It's safer and cheaper. The visual nighttime inspection method, where we went through those 3 procedures, all 3 of those need to be conducted at night. So this might be an option for you. Some people say, well, it's the only method that gives you an exact number to compare to the table. That is true. But again, like I've said before, the visual nighttime inspection, it's good enough. And that's why we've allowed it in the MUTCD. So if you want something a little more exact, sure, use the measured. But those instruments aren't cheap, and it's fairly expensive to send out inspectors and measure every single sign. And you're going to have to do that periodically, maybe once a year or every other year. You've got to measure all your signs again. Now, what some agencies are doing is they're using one of those visual nighttime inspection procedures, but then just on occasion they're renting one of these instruments and using it as a quality check of how their inspections are going and whether they're really catching all the dead signs that need to be replaced or not. So that's 2 of our methods we've covered. The third method is expected sign life method. And that's where you need to know what type of sheeting you're using on your sign, and then you determine what is the appropriate sign life in my geographical area. So if I'm using a beaded type 3 sheeting with that's the common name, high intensity, you could probably get some information, doing a little research online. You could get an idea of maybe how long those signs, high intensity signs, last in my area. Your state DOT probably already has that kind of information, has a feel for how long certain types of sheeting last in Florida. And then what you would do is you track the age of each one of your signs, and you replace each sign before the expected end of service life. So what some agencies do is they take the warranty period from the manufacturer. So if a manufacturer says, I'm warranting your sheeting for 10 years, the agency is saying, okay, we're going to track the age of our signs and we'll replace them before 10 years expires. But I have to tell you, from what information I've been seeing in research and from state DOT data, signs last quite a bit longer than the warranty periods. So if you're replacing them at the end of the warranty period, you're probably not getting as much out of your sign as you could. So you can save money by allowing those to go longer than just the warranty period. So I've added some stickers onto this slide from different states that were how they manage the life of their signs. They put a sticker on the back, and then most of them also have an inventory in a computer spreadsheet to track the age of the signs so they can anticipate future costs, replacement costs. So let's move on now to our fourth method. We've covered 3 so far. The fourth one is called blanket replacement method. And it's very similar to expected sign life. The expected sign life is really focused on each individual sign and tracking each individual sign and how old it is. With a blanket replacement sign, what you do is you break out your jurisdiction into an area by a corridor or a section. Break it out however you want. And what you do is you go in, and each year you replace all the signs in that group. And then you know your expected sign life for that type of sheeting. But instead of tracking each individual sign, you just say, okay, all the signs in this group I'm going to replace before X number of years. So you're treating signs in a grouping rather than tracking each one individually. So that's all that one is. It's pretty straightforward. Now I'm going to move into the fifth method that's allowed by the MUTCD, and that's called control signs. So this fifth method it's similar to the blanket replacement, but what you do is you're going to replace a group of signs in an area. So you have a neighborhood or a section of your district designated. That's your group of signs. You replace all the signs in that group. And then what you do is you just designate a subset of those signs to be the control signs. So say you replaced 300 signs in a group. I'm going to pick out 10 of those signs and designate those signs to be my control signs. And what you do is you just track the retroreflectivity of those 10 control signs. And when the retroreflectivity of those 10 control signs starts getting down to close to the values in that table, you know that more than likely all the signs in that group also need to be replaced. So it saves on resources. It's not as intensive inspection technique. You just track those 10 signs and say that represents all of my signs, and that's how I'm going to decide when to replace them. So there you have the 5 methods that are allowed. You can also use, as I say on the bottom, a combination of methods. And I gave you one example. A lot of agencies use the visual nighttime inspection method, but then they use the measured sign retro method as a quality check periodically. And what some LTAP centers do, local technology assistance program centers do, is the center buys a handheld retroreflectometer or two and then loans them out to the different members as they need them, because you sure don't need a handheld retroreflectometer an entire year. You just need to borrow it for a couple of weeks. So there's loaner programs set up. You can also rent these from the manufacturers of the handheld retroreflectometers. They rent them. I don't know what the cost is for doing that. Now here's a table that I just want to use as a check or kind of a recap of the sign retroreflectivity maintenance methods. And you can go on our FHWA website and you can find this table and download it if you want, or send me an email and I can send you a copy. But what I've done is I've listed the different methods and procedures down the left, and each picture represents a different procedure or method. For example, you can see that yellow warning sign there, kind of the blue row near the top. It says comparison panels on the left. You see a little comparison panel I've got on the sign. So you can go across any row there and see what the requirements are. For example, let's pick on the left, assessment methods, and then it's the third picture down, and you'll see that's called consistent parameters. And that was the one where we were trying to duplicate what we used in research. So you go across the table and you can see under equipment needs, you need a pickup or an SUV. That's the inspection vehicle. Whereas the two procedures above it, it says any vehicle is allowed. And then let's keep going across the right on that row for consistent parameters, and you'll see for inventory, there's a note 1 there, and you go to the bottom of the table and it says, note 1, not required in the METCD, but might be beneficial. So the FHWA is not requiring an inventory, but we think it would probably help you if you had one. And then you can go across further on the row to the right, see for inspector requirements, there's a red check. Down at the bottom of the table, the red check means required. So it is required to use a consistent parameters procedure that the inspector be trained and know what they're looking for and know how the procedure works. And the age is 60 years old or older. And you can take a quick glance at this table and you can see that that age requirement only applies to this one procedure. It doesn't apply to any other inspection method or procedure. Anyway, I just wanted to point out how this table worked if you want to use it later on. So if I could pull up that next poll now, please. And it's asking a question about compliance. Do you think your agency is in compliance with the requirements that I showed you, that you have a method in place and you are implementing that method? Not necessarily that you are replacing every sign yet, but you have the method in place and you could defend yourself if questioned in court. And I'm only asking for those public agencies to vote on this. Well, that's a real good percent. I think most webinars I give, I don't get that high a compliance rate. And of course, the onus is on you to decide whether you're really in compliance or not. But I normally get a lot lower, so you are doing really, really well, and I'm glad to see that number. Those of you in the other percent, the no, I'm hoping I'm helping you out a little bit, kind of understand what the requirements are. So let's go to the next one now, the next poll, please. And that's asking about, do you believe your agency will be taking further action based on what you just learned here? Or you think you're all set and you're good to go? That's actually, I'm seeing about 2/3 saying to probably take further action. That's good to see also, because most of the time when I work with agencies on this and they learn, well, yeah, we are in compliance, but I can see where we may be able to improve our procedures and maybe save a little money by doing this or that, or modifying it and using using maybe 2 of these methods instead of 1 and making sure we're in good shape. So I'm glad to hear, even though 3/4 of you think you're in compliance, 2/3 of you think you're going to take some further action. That's really good to see and very proactive. So let me move on now. What I'm going to do now before I get to some common questions is tell you where we stand with pavement marking retroreflectivity and the requirements for that. You are the first group of people that will hear this message because this is very up-to-date news that other people don't have. On the U.S. Department of Transportation website, you can find this, and I've given you the web link on the bottom if you wanted to write this down. It's kind of long, I apologize, but it's a report on Department of Transportation significant rulemakings. And this site is dedicated to Department of Transportation rulemakings that they consider to be significant. And what they do is put a schedule on here of anticipated rulemaking publications. And so what just came out in the middle of last week was this schedule on that website for pavement markings. And I know you can't read this well. I just wanted to show you this is what you'll find if you go to the website and you search for pavement markings, which is item number 24 on it. But let me show you now, in something easier to read, what that table tells you. For our pavement marking retroreflectivity rulemaking, this is the projected dates of when that rulemaking will progress. To OST, that's the Office of the Secretary of Transportation. So the pavement marking retroreflectivity rulemaking went to the Secretary's office on August 4th. Then the next step in any significant rulemaking is it has to go to the Office of Management and Budget, which is essentially the White House. And we are projecting that the rulemaking will go to the White House on September 4th of this year. And they have 3 months to review it and come back to us with questions, have discussions with us, ask for modifications, make decisions. And if they provide clearance, it's expected that it'll be provided no later than December 4th. If we get it by December 4th, it's expected that a Federal Register notice will be published on December 10th of this year. And what will be published is called a supplemental notice of amendment. And that's an amendment, another amendment to the MUTCD. And what will happen then is that everyone, all the public, all of you, will be allowed after December 10th to review it and make comments on it. And you'll be given 3 months to make comments. And then on February 10th, the comment period will close. And then we in FHWA, my team, will huddle up, look at every single comment, consider it, decide whether changes need to be made or not, and decide what to do with it in the future, whether we're going to publish it as we proposed here in December, or whether we're going to publish it with modifications, or I mean, we could even decide not to publish it if some really good reasons come up that we haven't thought about before. So that's a schedule that no one else has seen in a webinar yet. You're the first ones to see that. So kind of in summary for pavement markings, there is no rulemaking in place right now. The MUTCD requires your pavement markings to be retroreflective, but it's up to you to decide at what level because there are no levels published. So they still have to be retroreflective and you maintain them as you see fit. But as you can see by this schedule, there are probably going to be minimum requirements coming out, maybe similar to the signs that you'll need to start thinking about. Now let's go into some common questions. I told you before, since the sign retroreflectivity standard has been out since 2007. We've had a lot of years to hear questions, and I'm going to go through some of the common ones, and hopefully they address some of the questions you also have. So, does the MUTCD still require replacement signs based on retroreflectivity? And if I had the time, we would have done a polling question here, but I tried to limit some of those. I think all of you would get the answer correctly based on your knowledge I've already seen in the polling questions. But basically, it does still require replacement signs based on retroreflectivity. It's those signs identified through your method have exhausted their useful service life and need to be replaced. But the schedule for when you actually replace it, that's for you to decide and for you to defend. So does the MUTCD still require replacement signs? Absolutely it does. But you get to decide when to do it. So the next question, what about guide signs, including street name signs? Do they have to meet minimum retro requirements? It's a little bit of a trick question. Yes, they do have to meet the minimum. Remember the numbers in the table? There was the first row was white on green. Those are guide signs. So the standards for minimum retro still apply to guide signs, but there's no compliance date for including guide signs in your method. You're expected to add these signs to your method as you determine appropriate. I've heard that I'm not supposed to use engineering grade sheeting. Is that true? I'm betting most of you would get this correct. Engineering grade sheeting, ASTM type 1, is no longer to be used for warning signs, whether they be yellow or orange. Now, a lot of you may not have to deal with guide signs, but white legend on guide signs, you cannot use engineering grade as well. But where this really comes into play is on our warning signs. But the engineering grade sheeting can be used for other sign applications, although it may not be the most cost-effective choice. You've got to remember, even though your initial cost, engineering grade sheeting is the cheapest you can find out there, but it's also going to be the lowest retroreflectivity initially. So even though you may be able to, it may meet the minimums when you get it brand new for, say, a speed limit sign, what if it only lasts you 5 years? Whereas if you use a higher grade like a type 4, it may last you 20 years. That may be the better choice. But the type 1 or engineering grade would be allowed for all signs except warning signs. Can we inspect signs during the day to avoid overtime costs associated with nighttime inspections? Not if your agency's using that first method we went over, the nighttime visual inspection method. That's a nighttime visual inspection method. But you could use the measurement method during the day. So this picture here, the picture where the inspector has a flashlight up near their face and they're looking at this sign which has a comparison panel on it, we just took that during the day just to show the procedure. But that won't work during the day. It only works at night. And then this second sentence I have here, the MUTCD allows development of other methods as long as they are based on an engineering study that ties the method to the minimum retro levels. So if you can think of another method, as say if new technology becomes available, what FHWA is saying is that we're not closing the door on new technology. But any new technology you use and you're saying that's going to be our method, you need to have an engineering study that proves it, and that engineering study needs to be able to tie that method to the minimum retroreflectivity levels in that table. So here's another frequently asked question. If I use the nighttime visual inspection method, what are the requirements for the inspector? MUTCD requires a trained inspector but does not specify training requirements. It's important that your inspector understand how to perform the procedure in order to identify signs that are below or near the minimum level in the table. So again, I keep talking about the table and those minimum levels. All of you that are attending this, or for example me, I can't go out and just decide on my own whether a sign is good enough or not. I need to find a way to go out and decide whether a sign is above or below the numbers in that table. And there's no way I can do it unless I follow one of those procedures I laid out. Here's another question we get. We've been using nighttime visual inspection for a couple decades. Can I continue our system? I'll say it again. There are 3 very specific procedures that should be followed for your visual nighttime inspection method to comply with MUTCD. You've got to follow one of those procedures. There's some very large states in this country that have been using what they call a visual nighttime inspection method for a long, long, long time. But it's just a judgment call based on their inspector. And their inspector has no knowledge of those minimums and what those look like. So no, those would not meet the method requirement in the MUTCD. So here's another one. I heard a rumor that I have to turn in my retroreflectivity documentation annually to my FHWA division office for approval. Is that true? No. We're not requiring you submit any documentation. However, we know that it's advisable to keep some documentation available. You know, someday, some of you are going to be called into court because someone thinks, whether it's right or wrong, thinks that your bad sign contributed to a crash at night. And you will need to be able to prove that you had a method in place and that you were following the method. So if you have documentation, that's a way of doing that. Whether your sign was replaced or not is a secondary question. The requirement in the MUTCD is for you to be following your method. So here's a very common question. My agency has very limited budget to meet these regulations. Do you have any suggestions for cost-effective means of complying? The short answer is no. Those will vary significantly from one agency to another, and selecting the most appropriate method for you is a key factor in the overall cost. If you're going to measure every single sign every single year, that's going to be fairly expensive. If you're going to use a visual nighttime inspection, that won't cost you as much. What some agencies are looking at doing now is taking a new look at the signs they have on their roads. They may have put some signs up there 30 years ago because of maybe political pressure from some mayor or something like that. Well, maybe that mayor isn't around anymore. And maybe some of those signs that you didn't want to install in the first place could be taken down. Well, if they're taken down, if you decide they're no longer necessary for drivers, then you don't have to maintain the retroreflectivity on them. So that's one way of saving some costs in the long run. So you had a chat pod question about what happens if we don't comply with this. And here's my slide addressing that. It's just like the other standards in the MUTCD. There's no specific penalty spelled out. In the MUTCD, if you're not using, for example, an obvious thing like a red stop sign, you're using a purple round stop sign, and there's a crash, it's on you to defend your decision about using a purple round stop sign. And more than likely, you would not be successful in defending yourself. The standard for sign retroreflectivity is a shall condition, means you have to do it. And so if you're called into court and you're not following it, it's pretty easy for judge and jury to decide whether you're doing it or not. And if you're not doing it, you're not following the standard, it's going to be difficult for you to win a court case. So you're exposing yourself to potential liability. The last bullet I have is the possibility of risking your access to federal and state funding. For example, if you're looking to Florida DOT, their HSIP program, Highway Safety Improvement Program funding, to help you with a crash site and you want to make some improvements. There may be some questions brought up. Well, if you're not even following the MUTCD on sign retro, there's no way we're going to give you more money under the HSIP program because we know you're not following the MUTCD. Now, there's nothing written that would happen, but a state could make that decision, and also an FHWA division could make that decision if you're ignoring standards in the MUTCD. So let me summarize what I've covered today. We do have a sign retroreflectivity standard in place. The deadline's already passed. That was June of 2014. If I had to sum it up, it's requiring a method to be in place, and you need to be following it. That's it. Sure, it requires signs to be replaced if they don't meet those minimum numbers in that table, but you get to decide what's the appropriate timing for replacement. Another reminder, I probably said this too many times so you're sick of me hearing it, but it is important. There are specific procedures for each method. Don't just think you can send someone out, even an older driver or an older inspector at night, and saying, hey, we meet that procedure in that method. There are specific procedures, including that they be trained. Now, on the pavement marking retro standard, it's not out yet. We don't have a standard in place like we do for signs, but the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking, or some people are calling it supplemental notice of proposed amendment, is expected in December, and that will allow you 3 months to comment on it. I appreciate your attendance. Before I go, I want one more polling question, please, and then I'd like to point out where you can go for some additional information. If you could pull up the last polling question, please, for me. I'd like to just find out for my own interest whether this webinar was helpful to you. If it's not very helpful, I know I need to make some modifications to it. If it's helpful, that helps me for the next webinar I need to provide. Okay, well, good. That's good to hear. It's a little bit of a bummer when I give a webinar and I find out it wasn't very helpful to people. So it looks like it was helpful to a majority of you, and I appreciate you giving me that feedback. This last slide just gives you some website links if you want to write these down. And I know this whole presentation will be available for download afterwards. But this top one is just the FHWA MUTCD website where you can download the whole MUTCD or just reference, go to specific references if you want. Then we have the FHWA Nighttime Visibility website, which provides all kinds of different information on retroreflectivity, mostly of signs, but also some now on pavement markings. It gives you the regulations, the standards. It gives you technical guidance, some implementation tools. It goes over frequently asked questions like I just went over, but it's got probably another 24 questions also in there. And if you really want to get into the details, it provides you with the research we use to establish those minimum levels. And then if you need to go to the significant rulemakings website, if you need to show your supervisor or your policymakers that, listen, just want to give you a heads up, there's some more rulemaking coming down the road on pavement markings, it would be good to show them this schedule on pavement markings. You may want to jot down that website information there. So that's all I have. I'll turn it back over to our host, and I thank you for attending.
Well, we have a few questions and things in the chat, I guess, to clean up. You indicated that there is no formal requirement for the training for the inspectors. But are there any, is there any form of training that is available?
FHWA developed some training And we provided this training material package to all the local technology assistance program centers, the LTAP centers. So they all have it available, and the LTAP centers decide on their own whether they want to make that training available. So the LTAP centers would be the first place I would contact, and if you have difficulty there, I would contact me, and we'll see what we can get for you.
To that end, also with the Florida LTAP Center, they do have a retroreflectometer that is available for loan for Florida agencies.
Super. So that's great news.
That's a good resource that the guys here in Florida have.
Oh, wonderful.
Just to clarify on the ASTM Type 1 sheeting, that is allowed to be used for stop signs, correct?
Yes, that is correct. I don't know that that would be a wise choice for almost anyone because it starts out at such a low level. But if it meets the ASTM requirements for Type 1, it would meet the minimum retro when it's brand new. But it's not going to give you a very long life. So just advice, I would be very hesitant to use Type 1 for stop signs.
And one more question from the chat here. What federal aid funds are eligible to develop and maintain a program to replace signs?
The HSIP funds that I mentioned earlier, that goes to the state, those funds are eligible to use for a sign management program. Now, that being said, those HSIP funds are limited, and you have to compete with other needs throughout the state. And sometimes it's difficult to show that your needs for your signs are greater than, say, adding a turn lane at an intersection where we're having a lot of crashes. So although it's an eligible expense by law, it's legal, you still have to go through the process of showing your need, and then the state and division would want to be able to see that it would be a higher priority for you than some of the other sites competing for those funds.
I do not see any unanswered questions in the chat. With that, I guess I'll switch this back over to me and remind everyone again of that website. That's the TampaBayTrafficSafety.com/local area traffic safety academy, LATSA. And this is the location where you will be able to download your PDH request form, and the presentation will be available from this document library here as well. And the recording of the presentation will be available from here. So if there are no other questions in the chat, I will go ahead and stop the recording, and we'll stay on the line for a few minutes in case anybody wants to bring anything else up. Thanks everyone for attending. Oh, the next webinar is webinar number 8 is on September 17th, presented by Larry Hagan. That is on the empirical Bayes analysis for safety. If you have registered already through our SurveyMonkey that was sent out before, we will go ahead and register you on the GoToWebinar. But if you are new to the Safety Academy, you can follow the link there and register for the webinar. All right, well, thanks everyone for attending, and I guess this concludes our webinar.